Ethan and Clara had always been drawn to the strange and unexplored. As amateur paranormal investigators, they spent their weekends chasing urban legends. Their latest obsession was the small town of Ravenhollow, buried deep within the mist-shrouded forests of Oregon. Ravenhollow wasn't on any modern map. It was said to be abandoned decades ago after a mysterious series of disappearances. People spoke of strange lights in the woods, voices calling from nowhere, and a chilling fog that never lifted. Naturally, Ethan and Clara had to see it for themselves. The drive into the forest was uneventful at first, but as they approached Ravenhollow, the air grew colder. The sun seemed to dim, and a dense fog crept along the road, swallowing their surroundings. "Are we even going the right way?" Clara asked, squinting at the GPS. The screen flickered and froze, the signal lost. "We're close," Ethan said, his voice more confident than he felt. They passed a rusted sign, barely legible, "Welcome to Ravenhollow population." The numbers had been scratched out. The town emerged from the fog like a ghostly mirage. Crumbling buildings leaned precariously against each other, their windows black and empty. The streets were overgrown with weeds, and an eerie silence hung in the air. "Creepy as hell," Clara whispered, clutching her camera. "Perfect," Ethan replied, pulling out his flashlight. They parked the car near what looked like an old diner. Its sign dangled by a single rusted chain, swinging gently despite the still air. The word "diner" was barely visible beneath layers of grime and peeling paint. Inside, the diner was a snapshot of the past. Vinyl booths covered in dust, a jukebox leaning in the corner, and plates still sitting on tables as if the customers had left in a hurry. Clara snapped photos while Ethan explored the kitchen. He found a newspaper on the counter, its edges brittle and yellowed with age. The headline read, "Mass disappearances baffle authorities. Ravenhollow cursed." Underneath was a blurry black and white photo of a group of townsfolk standing near the edge of the forest. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with terror. Before Ethan could read more, Clara called out, "Do you hear that?" He froze. A faint whisper echoed through the diner, soft and unintelligible. It didn't sound like wind or creaking wood. It was distinctly human. "Hello?" Clara called, her voice shaking. The whispers stopped. "Let's keep moving," Ethan said, trying to sound calm. They left the diner and ventured deeper into the town. Every building told the same story, abandoned in a hurry, belongings left behind as if people had simply vanished. But it wasn't just the emptiness that unnerved them. It was the subtle signs of movement, shadows flickering at the edge of their vision, footsteps echoing a second too long, and those whispers growing louder, more insistent. As the fog thickened, they stumbled upon the town square. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like claws. Beneath it was a stone well, its edges worn smooth. Carved into the well's stones were strange symbols, almost like runes. They pulsed faintly in the dim light, as if alive. Clara crouched to take a closer look. "What do you think these mean?" Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the fog, which now seemed to swirl around them with purpose. A sudden gust of wind tore through the square, carrying with it a deep, guttural voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "Leave!" Ethan and Clara froze, their breath caught in their throats. The voice had no clear direction. It seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating through the fog and into their bones. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, gripping Ethan's arm. "Yeah," he said, swallowing hard. His bravado was gone, replaced by the gnawing realization that they might have made a mistake. The fog around them thickened, wrapping itself around their legs like a living thing. The whispers returned, louder now and overlapping, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. Ethan shone his flashlight into the fog. The beam seemed to die after only a few feet, swallowed by the dense mist. But something moved at the edge of the light, something tall and thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. "Run!" Clara said, her voice trembling. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Ethan's hand and bolted. They sprinted through the square, past the well and the oak tree, the whispers following them like a chorus of the damned. They ducked into a nearby building, slamming the door behind them. It was a church, or what was left of one. The pews were overturned, the stained glass windows shattered, and the air reeked of mildew and decay. "We need to get out of here," Clara said, gasping for breath. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were drawn to the altar. Something was wrong with it. The stone surface was cracked, and dark stains seeped from the fissures, pooling on the floor. Above it hung a wooden crucifix, but the figure of Christ was missing. Instead, the figure was carved directly into the wall behind the altar. A tall, shadowy shape with arms outstretched, its head replaced by a tangle of twisting serpentine forms. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. She followed his gaze and stepped back, her face pale. What is that?" Before Ethan could answer, the air in the church grew colder. Frost formed on the walls and floor, and their breaths turned to visible puffs. The whispers grew deafening, almost like screams, as if the walls themselves were crying out. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Ethan's hand and bolted. They sprinted through the square, past the well and the oak tree, the whispers following them like a chorus of the damned. They ducked into a nearby building, slamming the door behind them. It was a church, or what was left of one. The pews were overturned, the stained glass windows shattered, and the air reeked of mildew and decay. "We need to get out of here," Clara said, gasping for breath. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were drawn to the altar. Something was wrong with it. The stone surface was cracked, and dark stains seeped from the fissures, pooling on the floor. Above it hung a wooden crucifix, but the figure of Christ was missing. Instead, the figure was carved directly into the wall behind the altar. A tall, shadowy shape with arms outstretched, its head replaced by a tangle of twisting serpentine forms. "Clara," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. She followed his gaze and stepped back, her face pale. What is that?" Before Ethan could answer, the air in the church grew colder. Frost formed on the walls and floor, and their breaths turned to visible puffs. The whispers grew deafening, almost like screams, as if the walls themselves were crying out. The crucifix fell from the wall with a loud crash, and the dark figure carved into the stone began to move. Its arms stretched outward, and the twisting forms of its head writhed like living snakes. "Run!" Ethan shouted, pulling Clara toward the door. They burst out of the church and into the fog, which was now darker and thicker than before. The whispers were everywhere, closing in on them like a swarm. "This way!" Clara yelled, pointing toward the diner where they'd left the car. But when they reached the street, the car was gone. "That's impossible," Ethan said, spinning in circles. "We parked it right here." The fog swirled around them and the whispers shifted, forming words. "You can't leave." The shadows in the mist took shape again, tall, gaunt figures with glowing eyes. They moved closer, their long arms stretching toward Ethan and Clara. Panicking, Clara grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him toward the oak tree in the square. "The well!" she shouted. "Maybe there's a way out." They reached the well, but the runes carved into its stones now glowed brightly, casting an eerie red light on their faces. The whispers grew louder, screaming and chanting in a language they didn't understand. Ethan peered into the well. It was impossibly deep, the light of his flashlight disappearing into the abyss. But something was moving down there, something massive, its form shifting and undulating like liquid shadow. Clara pulled him back. "We can't go down there." "What choice do we have?" Ethan snapped. The figures in the fog were closing in, their eyes burning like embers. One of them reached for Clara, its bony fingers grazing her shoulder. She screamed and swung her camera, shattering it against the creature's face. It let out a guttural growl and recoiled. "Okay," Clara said, her voice shaking. "We go down." Ethan helped her climb onto the edge of the well. The stones were freezing to the touch, and the runes pulsed like a heartbeat. She grabbed the rope tied to the side and began to descend, her hands trembling. Ethan followed, the whispers growing fainter as they went deeper. But the further they climbed, the colder it became. The walls of the well were slick with some kind of black, tar-like substance, and the air was thick and suffocating. They descended for what felt like hours, the light above them fading until they were surrounded by darkness. Finally, they reached the bottom. The ground was soft and damp, and the air reeked of decay. In the dim glow of Ethan's flashlight, they saw a cavern stretching out before them. The walls were covered in the same runes as the well, and in the center of the cavern was a massive, pulsating mass. It was alive. The whispers returned, louder than ever, coming from the thing in the center. It writhed and shifted, dozens of black, snake-like appendages reaching toward them. Clara backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What is that?" Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at something carved into the cavern wall, a message written in jagged, hurried letters. "It sees you." Before they could react, the mass surged toward them, its appendages wrapping around their legs. They screamed, struggling to break free, but it was too strong. As the darkness consumed them, the whispers spoke one final word: "Stay."